Good afternoon, everybody. This is Jennifer Weiss with the Climate Action Reserve, and we are pleased to welcome you to this second webinar in our NACW Virtual Series. I will waste no time with long introductions on my end, and I will turn it over right away to Craig Ebert, who is president of the Climate Action Reserve. So over to you, Craig.
Thank you, Jenny, and I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. We were hoping to see everyone in person in San Francisco at our annual conference. Unfortunately, as we all know, global events have overrun that scenario. So we're going through a series of these virtual sessions based on some of the greatest panels we think we had pulled together for the conference. And we've got a fabulous one today on supporting local action, the California Climate Investment Program. There are often fundamental questions about where are the monies going that are generated by the cap and trade program, and you're going to hear a lot more about that today. Next slide, please. I want to take this opportunity to thank all of the companies and organizations that have helped sponsor us for the North American Carbon World. They're all listed here. You know, without their support, frankly, this wouldn't be possible. So again, thanks very much for your support. Next slide, please. Just wanted to quickly introduce the panelists here. We've got a great group. We have Coral Abbott, who's the program analyst for the Regional Climate Collaboratives Program with the California Strategic Growth Council. Amar Asusena Sid, who's the branch chief for Low Carbon Transit Operations Program at the California Department of Transportation. Bailey Smith, staff air pollution for the California Air Resources Board. And Sarah Weber, who's co-founder and executive director of the Berkeley Food Network. And last but not least, I want to turn it over to our moderator, Alvaro Sanchez, who's environmental equity director of the Greenlining Institute. Alvaro, over to you.
Thank you, Craig, and welcome everybody to today's webinar. It's my pleasure to be here today. My name is Alvaro Sanchez. I'm the director of environmental equity at the Greenlining Institute. The Greenlining Institute is a 26-year-old research, policy, advocacy, and leadership development organization that is based out of Oakland, California, but our work is a statewide perspective. For the last 6 years, my organization has been involved in shaping, implementing, monitoring, and championing climate investments that address poverty and pollution at the same time in California's priority communities. Over those years, we have learned a lot, but particularly we've learned how to make sure that equity is at the center of the way that California is fighting climate change. Now, 6 years may seem like a long time, but it actually isn't that very long when you think about all of the new things that the state is doing. We have programs unlike any other programs in the country, and when it comes to equity, it's a fairly new practice, and we're experimenting a lot with that here. So I want to spend a little bit of time on equity, because I want to make sure that we're all on the same page about what we mean when we say equity for the purposes of this webinar. Number one, equity is not equality. Equity acknowledges that people are starting from different places, not because of how hard they worked or because of how successful they are, but because those communities have faced systems of oppression, including racism, white supremacy, imperialism, that have hindered their ability to thrive economically. So those communities deserve additional support and systems to get them to par with their counterparts. Number two, equity is not only a commitment, equity is a practice. An equity commitment without a roadmap on how to achieve the equity outcome becomes a broken promise. So it's important for us to emphasize both the equity commitment that we hold, but also the practice on how to get there. Otherwise, we term that equity, which is not really what we want to do here. And number three, equity is a skill, just like engineering or finance. So it's unrealistic to think that everybody can do equity work. For those of us that are interested in equity outcomes, it's important to connect with equity leaders and experts who are well-versed in the language and the practice of equity. So I wanted to make those comments about equity because it's going to be an important factor in today's conversation, and because California is experimenting with equity practices more than any other state in the country. And the Climate Investments Program is one in which equity is showing up in really meaningful ways, as you'll hear from today's speakers. So I have 4 objectives for today in our time together. Number one, we want to share with you the latest information on the California Climate Investments Program, and there's a lot to share. Number two, we want to give you a sense of how the California Climate Investments Program works and how it kind of functions in the real world. Number three, we want to share with you lessons learned and best practices as we're all kind of doing this new work together. And number four, we want to discuss the future of this program in what is today a very uncertain time. So first, we're going to turn it over to each of the speakers for them to share with us their lessons, their experiences, and their programs, and then we're going to have a group discussion. But before we dive into the first speaker, I want to share with you the top 5 things that I learned when I reviewed this year's 2020 annual report to the legislature. So these are 5 facts that I found really interesting. The first one is that through November of 2019, a total of $12.7 billion have been appropriated by the legislature to advance the California Climate Investments Program. Number 2, 57% of implemented dollars have benefited priority populations. That's our equity commitment. And that translates to roughly around $3 billion. Number 3, $5.3 billion in implemented funds have leveraged an additional $21.7 billion from other sources. Number 4, to date, implemented California climate investment projects have provided direct support to 3,000 full-time equivalent jobs and more than 1,300 job training opportunities. And agencies report that 1,800 of those jobs and training opportunities were provided to priority populations. And number 5, the total GHG reductions of the investment suite over their lifetime equals to over 44 million metric tons of carbon. So those are 5 items that I found really interesting, and I wanted to share them with you at the top as we get into more details once we start talking to our speakers. So with that, I want to turn it over to Bailey Smith, who's going to tell us a little bit about how the California Climate Investments projects work, who is involved in these projects, and how they get funded. Bailey, would you like to take it off?
Yeah, thanks, Alvaro. That's a great introduction and some great facts. So the California Climate Investments, they're funded through the cap and trade auction proceeds. We have quarterly auctions that bring in revenue from the cap and trade program, and they're deposited into the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. So once those proceeds are in that fund, the California State Administration, the governor, and the legislature work together to make appropriations from that fund to individual state agencies to administer specific programs. So the whole framework and the requirements for how the money is spent is really largely set by legislation. And the appropriations must be consistent with this 3-year investment plan, and that's developed in partnership with financed by CARB. So a subset of these programs, mostly in the transportation sector, have ongoing multi-year funding commitments, and they receive a set percentage of each quarterly auction. Most programs, however, are funded annually through this deliberative budget process. As Alvaro mentioned, there's been almost $13 billion that have been appropriated so far, and that's been to over 20 state agencies to fund over 60 unique programs. So the programs support investments across all sectors of the economy, ranging from transit to housing to rooftop solar to wildfire prevention. But once these appropriations are made, each of those individual agencies is responsible for designing those programs and selecting those individual projects. Each agency defines selection criteria to prioritize projects, and those are consistent with the objectives of their own program, and that can range from air quality to water conservation. Some of the agencies create competitive grant programs, and others are distributing like first come, first served vouchers, and some may use the funds to support in-house planning or research or infrastructure projects. Agencies can also choose to pair those proceeds funds they get with other funding sources, such as federal funds. They may also try to incentivize other additional leveraged funds through specific selection criteria with preference points for match funding, All of the programs, however, must comply with the basic requirements for the fund, which is facilitating greenhouse gas emission reductions, but also maximizing co-benefits and maximizing benefits to disadvantaged communities. CARB's overarching role in the whole program is to provide guidance to these agencies on how to maximize those benefits, and we report on outcomes. As part of that role, we publish funding guidelines for these agencies that receive money that just lay out the ground rules and best practices and recommendations for program design. Most of our coordination, however, is really the result of these relationships we've built with all of our sister agencies who've received funds and building on lessons learned from program implementation. CARB staff reviews and provides recommendations on program guidelines and solicitation materials, including scoring criteria and accounting methods, and consulting on reporting and auditing provisions. But it's really this collaborative effort where agencies are designing dynamic programs to address a whole suite of programs. So that's basically how funding gets from the auction proceeds to agencies, ultimately to some grantees and homeowners and businesses across California.
Thank you, Bailey. So I mentioned commitment to equity, and also mentioned some of the things that 57% of the funds going to those priority population. Can you tell me how the agencies work together to meet the statutory requirements established by SB 535 and AB 1550?
Yeah, so those two pieces of legislation are like landmark legislation, and it really shaped the way that we even think about how we implement investments as a whole. Those pieces of legislation, they require 35% of funding to benefit priority populations. And those priority populations are residents of disadvantaged communities, low-income communities, and then low-income households statewide. So the goals that are in statute are really for the overall CCI program. However, some programs are really better suited to providing meaningful benefits to communities than others. So as soon as an agency gets an appropriation, we work with them to develop individual targets for their program. So say a program was appropriated funds for weatherizing homes for low-income individuals. Well, that program will probably have a 100% goal for low-income communities because that's how the program was designed. There are other programs that maybe are appropriated funds for, upgrading the energy efficiency of a water turbine. That's probably not going to have a very high target at all. But as a whole, we try to get each program's an individual target so that we meet that overall 35% objective. As part of our funding guidelines, we provide direction for those agencies on how to actually get those investments in those communities. It could be locating them in physically within disadvantaged communities, providing job training for local residents, enhancing cost savings for low-income individuals. It looks different based on program design. Each individual agency really carefully designs their program to make sure that they're targeting those communities, and they can do that through eligibility requirements, extra scoring points on applications. They can do outreach, reduce match funding requirements. There's a variety of strategies to try to get funds to priority populations. So as they're funding these programs, CARB develops these very specific criteria that are specific to the type of project that's being funded, and that's used whether to determine whether that individual project both meets a community need that was identified by the community and provides a direct and meaningful assured benefit to a priority population. So the agencies use a variety of different strategies to identify those community needs. It could be direct community engagement or collecting letters of support. But each of the investments that are counted towards these goals are really highly scrutinized. So agencies take really great care in collecting information from applicants to evaluate each of those projects that we're counting. For example, if you have a tree planting project in an urban area, the agencies collect data on each individual tree planted to make sure that a majority of those trees are located within a census tract that's designated as a disadvantaged community. If you have a transit line, that line must service a station that provides access to residents of a disadvantaged community. So this is goes through great efforts to collect this information, but the result of this is that we have really high confidence that these investments are really making a difference in people's lives. Of course, we don't stop there. We host meetings with all the agencies on lessons learned and program implementation and outreach, how to target benefits better. We create these multi-agency forums to provide an opportunity to connect everyone just so we can continually improve program design and the project outcomes in an equity lens. So.
Great, thank you, Bailey. I want to hand it over to Coral, and Coral, it'd be great for you to share with us from an agency that administers some of these funds, what your agency does and how it relates to the Climate Investments Program.
Yeah, thank you, Alvaro, and thank you, Bailey, for setting the stage for this conversation. So I am Coral Abbott. I work for a state agency called the California Strategic Growth Council, and we're charged with working collaboratively with public agencies, communities, and stakeholders to achieve sustainability, equity, economic prosperity, and quality of life for all Californians. Our focus, for the most part, is on the greater built environment, with a particular focus on supporting communities to develop healthy neighborhoods, while at the same time helping to meet state climate goals. So I think the major way that we do this is through the administration of a suite of grant programs funded through the California Climate Investment. So as Bailey was discussing, we're one of those sister agencies that receives funds for programs that are funded through the cap and trade system. So to give a really quick run through of those programs, the first is the Transformative Climate Communities Program. This program makes neighborhood scale investments that are intended to spur transformation, and it is unique in that it empowers the most disadvantaged communities in the state that are most impacted by pollution to choose their own goals, strategies, and projects to reduce emissions and air pollutants. And it's done in part through very strong community engagement and community leadership requirements for that program. Our largest CCI program is the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Program. That makes investments in affordable housing, transit, active transportation, and urban greening in a really integrated manner. And the intention of that program is to build healthier communities while simultaneously reducing vehicle miles traveled, which is one of the largest sources of emissions in the state. And then we have the Sustainable Agricultural Lands Conservation Program, which is kind of a sister program to Affordable Housing Sustainable Communities that preserves agricultural land, particularly in areas with strong growth pressures, to help prevent sprawl. So doing an infill conservation kind of joint strategy through our programs. We also have the Climate Change Research Program, which invests in cross-cutting research investments that build community resilience, integrate land use and development considerations, and facilitate the transformation of California communities, again with really strong incentives to involve community in that research. And then finally, we have the Technical Assistance Program, which is kind of unique in that that program focuses on providing technical assistance to the suite of California climate investment programs, both at SGC and at other agencies, and providing tailored technical assistance on a program by program basis, depending on what that program needs to reach disadvantaged communities and community members, as well as to achieve equitable outcomes through the program.
Great, thank you. Could you share with us, what are the types of things that anchor the work that you do at your agency, given the fact that you run so many different programs and they're fairly comprehensive and unique on their own?
Yeah, of course. So I think achieving equitable outcomes really drives a lot of our work, as it does much of the climate investment programs, but there are a few specific components that carry out from that based on what our focus is and what our programs are focused on. The first of those I would say is infill and conservation, which doesn't immediately necessarily seem like an equity strategy, but because of our focus on the built environment and the fact that personal vehicle use is such a large source of emissions, our goal is to really develop healthy, livable, and dense communities while simultaneously preventing growth into natural and working lands. And so that's making sure that everyone is able to live in a safe and healthy community, and also just acknowledging that the impacts often of those emissions from personal vehicle use ends up being felt the most by disadvantaged and low-income community members. One other huge through line in our work is meaningful community engagement and leadership. So since many of our investments are intended to benefit disadvantaged communities whose members have historically been left out of the decision-making process for land use decisions and research needs, we find it critical to bring in and center community voices through our programs. And one additional hope is that we know that we're making one-by-one investments in all of these communities that aren't necessarily going to transform everything, but we hope that going through the process of actually applying it to and implementing these programs can help to change, help develop processes for local governments, industry, academia, to do this engagement outside of just our grant opportunities. And ultimately be able to see the value in putting forward community-supported projects. Another really big one is anti-displacement, especially for our built infrastructure programs. So it's really well known that putting bike lanes, trees, and other wonderful amenities in low-income neighborhoods can spur gentrification. But at the same time, these community members deserve to live in healthy, safe neighborhoods. So the answer isn't to not make the investments, it's to make the investments and simultaneously encourage policies to the extent that we can as the state that prevent the displacement of existing community members. And the last one I'll touch on really quickly is workforce development, which I think kind of is in line with anti-displacement. And Bailey touched on this as well, as I think so did you, Alvaro, that as investment comes into a community, community members should have an opportunity to economically benefit from the construction of those investments. So building in opportunities for that is important through our programs, as well as receive job training for career path jobs, which we see as a form of an anti-displacement measure in and of itself.
Hey, thank you, Coral. I'm sorry. I want to turn it over to Amar from another sister agency to get your perspective around the work that you do and how it supports the climate investments program. So Amar, welcome, and could you share with us about your work in your agency, please?
Yes, thank you, Alvaro, for having us and navigating the discussion. It's also good to see Bailey and Coral on here since I've worked with you guys in the past, so it's pretty cool in our telework status right now. But yeah, so I currently manage the Low Carbon Transit Operations Program, otherwise known as LCTOP. This is under Caltrans administration. Caltrans also partners with the California Transit Agency, or CalSTA, to work with our sister program, which is the Transit Intercity Rail Capital Program, TRCP. So I'll primarily be talking about LCTOP and my role that it has with CCI. So the Low Carbon Transit Operations Program is a statewide funded program, again, established in 2014. So we're going on to our 6th year of awarding projects. We're an annual appropriated program where we receive 5% of the total CCI I guess, funded programs. We average around $100 to $150 million a year. This program really works closely with the 200 plus eligible transportation entities. So this could be our MPOs or the operators within the region. So generally our trans agencies come in for an award on this program. We fund operating and capital assistance for our transit agencies with a goal of reducing GHG emissions and improving mobility for the general public. LCTOP is one of the programs that has a higher, I guess, percentage base to make sure that we're benefiting disadvantaged communities. So agencies that have a disadvantaged community as defined by CalEnviro screen must expend 50% of their apportionment to benefit these communities. So for LCTOP, we generally are able to document these benefits, kind of following up on Bailey said, as long as an agency is able to identify stops and locations within communities that can benefit. So this could be with a number of different ways on some of the project types that we are able to award, such as new and expanded, or enhanced transit. So think about like service frequency for trans agencies, maybe new lines. This could also be with free or reduced transit passes and vouchers. In 2016, the program expanded a little bit so that it could capture and award capital projects, specifically zero emission vehicles infrastructure as standalone projects. So when we're looking at benefiting community, looking at any type of transit stations or stops that may be having infrastructure to support zero emission vehicles that are going to be running within disadvantaged communities that maybe have high diesel particulate matter. And then also other projects such as stops or station improvements or amenities, meaning maybe some solar lightings or actual shelters that would provide some safety and security against like inclement weather. We had a lot of community members down in Stanislaus County asking for upgraded shelters at stops that really had no designated sign where the shelter was constructed to provide shade during the hot weather communities areas. So that's kind of like I guess maybe a background of what LCTOP is. We annually award these projects. We have so far about 685 projects to date that have been awarded by LCTOP, totaling $377 million. Of this, I want to say over 80% has benefited disadvantaged communities and low-income communities. I guess when you look at it, it's AB 1550 priority populations. So that's kind of the background on LCTOP. A little bit about TRCP, which is our sister program. This is a competitive program. It's a capital-based program funding capital investments and infrastructure throughout the state. They do a biannual award and they receive 10% of the total CCI amount, and they also receive SB1. So this is a larger capital program, again, competitive, where it looks at like really large projects throughout the state for investment. So I think I covered the first part, Alvaro. Is there anything else you want me to address?
Sure, if you could just briefly kind of, it sounds like the program does a lot of different things and there's several layers of it. If you can give us a sense of a project that stands out in your mind that kind of achieves the goals of the programs that you oversee, just kind of what it might look like in the real world, that'd be fantastic. If you could do it in a minute or so, that'd be great.
Yeah, one particular program, well, it's actually one particular agency that comes to mind did something that I thought was really holistic with these dollars. They came in for the first 2 years to procure small shuttle cutaway buses down in the Central Valley. So this is the city of Shafter, which is right outside of Bakersfield. It's a very small community. They're located all within the DAC and low-income communities. So these 2 first years, they procured a handful of zero-emission vehicles with LCTOP dollars. Then they use a little bit of local money to wrap the buses with community member images, where they did a community vote to see who can get on these buses and have their images with some positive like sayings. The following year, with I think it was 16-17, they used LCTOP dollars to actually operate these buses within the community on a new route that was circling in what their Main Street area is, picking up a lot of elderly and disabled community members in the daytime, and then also some young students when school lets out. So they partnered with the school bell signal. Then the following year, they used the funds from LCTOP to actually make the service fare free. So instead of charging their fare for the general public, they made the entire service free for 2 years. They're now going into another procurement to procure additional buses as they are maxed out on this particular service. There's only so many people that can fit on each bus, and we had talked with the community of Shafter, where they had some members actually lining up earlier and earlier to catch these buses so that they can get on and meet particular meetings. So they're really trying to increase frequency, and to do that, they would need additional zero-emission buses. So that's one particular community that really, in my opinion, did a holistic approach where they procured zero-emission buses, they operated them with our dollars, and then they did free fare for the community.
That's great. Thank you so much for giving us that example of a real benefit to a community. And it's a good transition over to Sarah, who is here as an awardee, someone who received some of these funds. Welcome, Sarah. And it'd be great. Could you share with us about your work and how you have benefited from the Climate Investments Program?
Yeah. So we're involved in, well, our grant comes through the Food Waste Prevention and Rescue Grant. And within the world of providing free food to people who are food insecure, so a number of different types of programs address those needs. But recovering food from grocery stores and even restaurants and farmers is not unusual. It's been around for decades. But now that there's more awareness of the need for this kind of programming in our attempts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, my organization decided to take a really innovative approach to all of our work, and in particular to think about how we could reimagine that food recovery work as a way to really leverage more and better food for people that we're feeding, and what are all the ways that we can use that food. So we're really fortunate to have a really large warehouse space. We created what we're calling our after-hours drop-off room. So donors of recovered food can bring food to us anytime that it works for them. We have coolers, logs, shelving for shelf-stable food, and then we can turn that food either into meals for our clients or just use it in our own pantry distributions. And the meal program has been super exciting. We convert recovered food currently into vegetarian meals, extremely healthy whole grain vegetables. And the really amazing thing is that our clients have discovered that they love this food. It's maybe was food they wouldn't have eaten before, but we have an excellent chef who's come up with our recipes and oversees the making of the meals. And we've just now discovered that this is an extremely good way to bring really healthy food to our communities in ways that they really like, in ways that are super convenient to them, but also is doing this work of reducing food waste in our community. So I think that gets to what you asked.
Yeah, thank you. It sounds like a great program. Could you talk to us about your experience applying for these resources?
Yeah.
How was that? Was it difficult? What kinds of questions you had? It'd be great to hear from your perspective.
Yeah. So, and I'm going to expand that answer a tiny bit. It's actually was a pretty hard grant for like a one-person development program to be doing, but I felt like the process really helped me think through how we would do this program. So all the pieces of the grant application forced me to think it through really carefully. And something that I've really liked about, and so I guess actually to expand on that a little bit, it would be useful if you were applying to have a number of people working on the different pieces, but it's totally doable by one person. The other thing I just wanted to expand on a little bit is that, post receiving the grant and turning in my reporting and working with with my program person, that I really like the way it's set up so that I can evolve my program. So we have goals, but maybe I'm not meeting certain goals because, it turns out that there were a couple of glitches and that we're able to work them out and create a really solid program. So I feel really confident that we're creating a model that can be really leveraged pretty deeply across my sector to do really effective work, both feeding people and reducing waste.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. And it sounds somewhat similar to what Amar was describing in Shafter, a program that evolved over the years and their participation. So it sounds like you have that same kind of experience and opportunity. Well, thank you everybody for sharing a little bit about your work. I know that was quick, but I did want to kind of have a little bit of time to talk to you all about just the different experiences that you all bring to this work. I think what I heard is just the different, like the variety and the amount of things that are happening with the climate investments programs. It's a lot. Again, I've been working on this for 6 years, and even I come to find new things every time I talk about it. For Bailey, Coral, and Amar, knowing how much there is to share about these programs, if you were limited to one thing that you'd like to share to everybody, like this is the top thing that I want everybody to know about the Climate Investments Program in California, what might that be? And if I could ask my speakers to keep your answers brief so that we can go through some other questions. Yeah, what would you like everyone to know about these programs that are operating in California? Bailey, would you like to share?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and I really think that with one thing I want to share is the breadth itself. I feel like when you have a greenhouse gas mitigation program, most people know that they can, drive down emissions by switching to an electric vehicle or switching out their light bulbs. But I think what we're demonstrating with CCI is that there are so many ways that you can reduce emissions. And we see it from restoring wetlands to applying compost to ag land. And we're just showing that there's all of these ways that we can achieve benefits while also achieving all of these other benefits like clean water and climate resiliency. So I just feel like the one thing I would share is that we have this whole toolbox of tools to use to achieve our climate goals, but we can do that while gaining so much more than just the carbon benefits.
Thank you. Coral?
Yeah, great question. So I think one thing that I would want to highlight is that when we talk about resilience to climate change, we know that the most vulnerable communities and community members are who are going to be hit the hardest. So it's really strategically important that we continue to make investments in disadvantaged and low-income communities for our overall resilience as a state, and that we should continue to make investments in this way, and it should be something that others look to if they're thinking about developing their own programs focused on climate change or climate resilience.
Mar?
Yeah, I thought this was a little bit of a hard question because I do think there are so many things that are great about CCA, like Bailey said, but I think for me, looking at what I would want to share with the general public is that these are public dollars and they are intended to benefit communities. So when you have programs like the Low Carbon Transit Operations Program, the public should really try to kind of push a little bit to make sure that those dollars are actually benefiting their particular community. So you can look at how these dollars are investing back into our communities that prioritize disadvantaged communities or disadvantaged and low-income communities. So I would really try to, I guess, lament and kind of shout out how these dollars are really supposed to be dedicated to our most impacted folks that are being harmed by climate deterioration.
Thank you. So yeah, I mean, it sounds like there's so many programs, kind of the breadth and depth of the programs, an emphasis on priority populations and helping them mitigate the exposure to pollution that they face, but also work up towards being more resilient to a changing environment. All really good things to share about the program. Sarah, for you, I wanted to ask if you had to recommend something to folks that are interested in pursuing some of these resources, having gone through the experience, like what might you share to them? Like where would you tell them to get started?
So I guess really you'd have to understand your capacity really well. I feel like I was really well situated to be able to, start out small, work out the program, all the kinks in the program, and then be well positioned to make a very big expansion over time. So I think that and also the other thing is that we're in this phase now where it's working stuff out, like what is really going to work, what are good models. So I feel like that might be another thing that you would want to be interested in, is just really understanding how effective the program that you're interested in can be, and how flexible and scalable it is.
Mm-hmm. And kind of along the same lines, Coro and Amar, both of your agencies really emphasize technical assistance in providing that to applicants. Why is that? Why is that such an important aspect of the work that your organizations carry out?
Yeah, I'll touch on that really quickly. So we've talked about how the Climate Investments Program have a focus on getting funds to disadvantaged and low-income communities. But I think it's also really important for us to recognize that the same structural issues that led these communities to be considered disadvantaged also have resulted in them often not having the resources available to apply to these hugely complex, technically complex grant programs that require non-traditional partnerships and a ton of staff time. So in order to achieve our targets and also the outcomes that we want with these programs, I think it's necessary to build the capacity of organizations within disadvantaged communities to ensure that they are able to have a fair shot at a lot of these programs and benefit from the investments to the best extent possible.
I agree. I think for Caltrans, with the two programs, LCTOP and the TRCP program, they receive an annual apportionment. So that's a good chunk of the CCI programs, and really who's eligible to come in for a project are our trans agencies and regional entities, so not necessarily the general public. And I think the technical assistance for LCTOP, since it's a non-competitive program, formulaic program, myself and my staff really are able to work with our transit agencies to really assist in like the quantification portion. We partner with CARB on that. But how do we link up our transit agencies to ensure that they're communicating with the public on developing the projects to begin with? So I think Caltrans is starting to push for these linkages and building out better projects and linking up trans agencies and regional partners with CBOs to really come up with projects that the community really wants. That's something that we did see on the last round of FY 18-19, where we had some TA that was done with community-based organizations, and they were really pushing for free and reduced fare for students in the LA area. And so I think that partnership really helps us build out that meaningful and direct benefit to disadvantaged communities when we're looking at these types of projects where communities not necessarily able to apply for.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Thank you. I want to take us into kind of the current context that we're in. Obviously, everybody is under a very different environment these days. And the California Climate Investments Program is not shielded from what's happening in the world. So I wanted to ask you all, given the COVID situation, given the outlook on California's budget, given the strength of the cap and trade market, what are things that are coming up for you that you are planning for or maybe concerned about in the years to come? If every one of you could share a little bit about that, that'd be great. And again, if we could keep the answer short, that'd be really helpful so that we all have a chance to share. Anybody care to start?
So I can. So our work is very clearly impacted by the COVID-19 situation. We've seen the number of people we're serving grow by 3 times in the last 8 weeks. So there's huge need. We imagine that's going to continue for quite a while. So we're expecting to see growing numbers for months ahead. And so now the food recovery landscape is looking very uncertain to us. initially there was a lot of food to recover as restaurants closed down, school cafeterias. So we received, at least double the amount of food we normally do in a month right away in March and April. And we think that that's going to continue for the next few months, but we're really going to have to reimagine what it will look like when, as what is predicted, a lot of food businesses close down in the next months. So we're actually kind of keeping with our be really flexible, be really agile, and really pay a lot of attention to what's going on in our community and figure out how best to leverage that for the work we're doing, because that food is going to be more needed than ever.
That's right. That's right. And for the folks that are on the agency side, yeah, what are the types of things that are coming up for you all in this new environment?
I can talk about a little bit from like the big picture perspective of all of CCI. I mean, I think COVID is kind of marked by uncertainty, so we really don't know what it's going to look like in the future. But it's for us, it's just the role of CCI to contribute to like climate and equity issues seems more important than ever, because we've seen what these funds can do, and especially what they can do for the people who are hardest hit, not only by climate, but also these same folks are the hardest hit by COVID. So some of the things that we've been planning and preparing for is, looking a lot at the data of what programs we have and what are the outcomes, and how can we make sure that we're supporting those essential programs that are providing economic resiliency and benefits and equity benefits. One of the stats you mentioned was about jobs outcomes. So we go through a lot of effort to collect a lot of information about what programs are supporting jobs and what programs have the potential to support jobs across the economy. So from that perspective, we can see, and we've seen, that CCI is really effective in supporting workforce development and economic development. So what a great opportunity to use this as part of the recovery effort for a broader economic recovery package. So we're hopeful that CCI can continue to do what it's doing and really target those who are hardest hit by this.
Yeah, I would echo what Bailey had to say there. I know CARB is really thinking a lot about this from the big picture frame. Something we've been thinking about just in the midst of the uncertainty is how to kind of tell the message of how the work we're doing around capacity building and supporting communities to do the sort of longer term community supported planning can lead to broader resiliency. So of course, resiliency in a climate sense, but resiliency to disaster writ large, and how to think about how to use these same tools and conversations that we've been having around that to assist with COVID recovery and relief as well. And we're right at the beginning of that as the situation shifts day to day, but hope to continue to have that be a strong part of our work moving forward.
Amar?
Yeah, I think it's what we're seeing right now during this pandemic is kind of exacerbating some of the bigger issues that we have seen in the transportation industry. We have a lot of transit agencies that have actually stopped service altogether during this time, and reduced frequency. I mean, like huge service changes for the public transit agencies, and how that really impacts the general riders. We're looking at data on who's still riding our services. So it's really those particular riders that are really the base riders, the core riders that I think we need as the public to really center on, to make sure that the service is really prioritized for the riders that are still riding today. As service picks up, that's a lot of uncertainty for transit agencies. There's a huge shortfall in funding for operations right now, because a lot of our operators rely on that fare box revenue collection. They rely on tax measures for specific operations. And so right now, a lot of agencies have gone to fare-free collections to help the health and well-being of their actual bus drivers or their train operators. And so they're having them not collect fare or do onboarding in the rear of a bus if that's the capability. So going forward, what we're seeing with LCTOP is agencies expanding their fare-free programs or reduced fare programs to really assist with not collecting fare at this time. I'm not sure how that's going to look for the longevity of transit, but I think this is really highlighting overall issues in terms of how the state can assist in providing operational support for all of our operators. We have over 200 plus public operators within the state of California, so there's a lot of service that's being impacted, and we're seeing it really heavily hit in some of our urban areas right now, as well as our rural areas who I think are prioritizing dial-a-ride and micro transit mobility options during this time.
So yeah, a lot of uncertainty for sure. Jennifer, do we have any questions from audience members that we can ask the panelists?
Hi, Alvaro. We do. Right now, we only have one question. And I failed to mention at the beginning that if you do have a question, feel free to enter it in the question box in your control panel for the webinar. The one question that we do have now is from Robert Archer. His question is, across the agencies and programs, is there a consistent method to estimate or measure the CO2 emission reductions and estimated cost per ton for CO2? How is the climate impact assessed?
Yeah, so I could answer that. So part of our role at CARB is to provide guidance on how to track outcomes. And through that guidance on how to track outcomes, we develop these quantification methods for estimating greenhouse gas emissions and co-benefits from each project. So we have a standardized method that applies to all of a given project type. So our standard method of how to calculate the emission reductions from a zero emission vehicle looks very different from a forest health project, but all projects within that project type must fill out our standardized method, and we estimate emissions over the life of the project. So that is how we provide that accounting. When we look at cost effectiveness, we also report out on the amount it costs for the whole project and the amount of funds that of California Climate Investments funds that are used for that project. So you can look at the dollar of state investment or the dollar of total investment, and you can compare that to a number of metrics, not just GHGs, but you can see, what are the water savings per gallon per dollar. So we have a suite of metrics that we collect with standardized methods.
Thank you, Bailey. Well, we have only a few minutes left in the webinar, but I did want to kind of wrap up with both thinking about the recovery efforts and what we need to do moving forward to address climate change and build the resiliency of our state. I always think about the California Climate Investments Program as a little bit of a preview to what a Green New Deal might look like. If you all were talking to the architects of the Green New Deal, based on your experience here, what is something that you would make sure that was included in that architecture of hopefully an effort that is like the California Climate Investments, but done at a federal level? Why don't we start with, oh yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I would say for me, it's to prioritize equity and transparency. I think that getting the biggest GHG per dollar is a sole focus of the program. Really overlooks the capability of these funds to address historical inequities and benefit those overburdened communities. So the capacity of this to really achieve multiple benefits is really one of the greatest successes. So really prioritizing those multiple benefits and the equity piece and including transparency throughout it, I think is it's a model that's really easily replicated that I think we've been successful at.
Yeah, I would echo Bailey there definitely as that with that recommendation. I think that's something that has come up quite a bit through SGC's work, likely because we focus so much on the built environment, is the concerns from communities about potential for gentrification. We've heard in all of our programs when we were getting feedback on program design. So I would really encourage that to be something that's considered at the front, to think about the impacts of making investments in communities and how to address it before you start making those investments or simultaneously. As we know, gentrification is an issue nationwide, not specific to California.
Sarah, would you like to share?
Well, I feel like that, especially when you're thinking in terms of equity, that food recovery for use in food insecurity programs is not really the greatest way to think about equity in that realm, because we're operating currently in the sort of two-tiered food system, and people who are very low income are really subjected to this second tier food system. So I think in terms of a Green New Deal and equal access to the healthiest food, there has to be a whole rethinking of how the food system works. So it's not really like within the context of this grant or anything, but it is a really, really important question. And it could have to do with how food is produced and how people think about the way they use food to reduce waste from the source.
Right, right. So, Amar?
I think I agree with all of you guys, what you have said. I think really prioritizing Black, Indigenous communities to ensure that these particular communities, our communities, have an actual say in the development of the actual programs and projects that come out of whatever a Green New Deal may be. I think with CCI, we have a starting template here, and I think it could be replicated statewide, or nationwide. But I think really prioritizing our communities that have been historically harmed by racist policies that really impact the health and well-being of our communities is something that we really need to take a deep dive into. I think reflecting back on what we're seeing right now with COVID, you see a lot of our communities that are continuously being harmed, that have overlaying like health disparities related to where we're living. And so making sure that we're centering the programs to really speak to what communities actually want. Like clean water is very basic and essential that many communities do not have. And when you look at Dene, Navajo Nation, like there's no clean water in many of their boundaries, and you look at Flint, still no water. Like these are basic things that people can communicate now on what they would like in a New Deal, not necessarily related to transit or transportation, but those are things that I think could really inform the health and well-being that would cover, I think, a lot of our overlapping programs and how the Green New Deal could actually work.
Great. That sounds great. Thank you all for sharing. I mean, what I'm hearing here about the California Climate Investments Program is that we're seeking to be comprehensive, holistic, equitable. We're seeking to change systems. I mean, you know, the food system is one that we're looking at through the lens of a California Climate Investments Program, and that we want to emphasize rectifying some of the wrongs of how we got here. That moving forward, we want to change dynamics so that those injustices don't persist in a clean energy environment. So I think this is a great program. I've learned a lot from all of you today. Thank you so much for joining us, and for everybody who joined the webinar, thank you for being here. I think with that, we're going to wrap it up, and you know, everybody enjoy the rest of your day. So Jennifer, unless there's anything else, I think this would be a good time to wrap it up.
Alvaro, thank you so much to you and the other panelists. Like you mentioned, CCI is such an important program that has had such a profound impact and will continue to. So it's great that everybody who joined this webinar was able to learn more about it. And for those who were not able to join, we will be posting a recording of the webinar. Here is a link to that. You could just go to YouTube and search for Climate Action Reserve. As Craig mentioned earlier, this is part of our NACW Virtual Series. So we'd like to invite everybody to our next webinar, which is happening next Thursday, May 21st, 10 a.m. Pacific time, 1 p.m. Eastern time. And that webinar will be looking at natural working lands. And then just In a final note of wrap up for this, we owe not only a great thanks to our fantastic panelists today, but we just wanted to throw out another thank you to all of the NACW supporters. That includes not just the sponsors we mentioned earlier, but also the supporting organizations and media partners who support the conference. A very important component of NACW is the collaborative nature, bringing together government agencies, nonprofits, the business community, the academic community, and you see that reflected in these organizations and companies that are listed here. So we would just like to send another thank you out to all of you. So thank you again. Thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you to all of you who were able to join us. And take care. Take good care during this very uncertain time.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.